On the morning of July 19th, 1945, at precisely 0700 hours, Commander Eugene Flucky peered through USS Barb's periscope and spotted a Japanese supply train winding its way along the Kaputo coastline, a train packed with troops and ammunition destined to kill American soldiers unless he found a way to stop it. At just 31 years old, Flucky had already commanded Barb through 5 war patrols and sent 17 enemy vessels to the ocean floor. The Japanese were running half a dozen trains daily along that coastal railroad, with each one transporting between 40 and 60 soldiers alongside ammunition and supplies bound for the Kashiho garrison. For 3 weeks now, Flucky had been prowling the Sea of Okhotsk, hunting for targets. The Gato-class submarine USS Barb, weighing 2,400 tons when submerged, carried a crew of 80 men and had become one of the Pacific Fleet's most highly decorated submarines, boasting 4 presidential unit citations, 8 battle stars, and a Navy unit commendation. What truly made Barb dangerous, however, wasn't the collection of awards she'd earned. It was the man commanding her. Just 3 months earlier, Flucky had been awarded the Medal of Honor, with the citation describing his audacious attack on Nam Quan Harbor off China's coast in January 1945. He'd taken Barb into waters so shallow the submarine couldn't dive, with minefields flanking both sides and Japanese destroyers patrolling the entrance, all to attack 30 merchant ships anchored inside what the Japanese considered an impregnable defensive position. Flucky attacked regardless. He launched 6 torpedoes into the convoy, followed by 4 more, then executed a high-speed surface run through uncharted waters while depth charges detonated all around them. 8 ships went down with 0 American casualties. The brass at Pearl Harbor called it the war's most audacious submarine attack, but Flucky wasn't satisfied. By June 1945, Japanese merchant shipping had virtually disappeared from the Pacific, leaving American submarines struggling to find targets. Before Barb's 12th and final war patrol, Flucky approached the Navy's research and development staff with an unconventional request. He wanted rockets. The Mark 51 launcher could hold 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, each carrying 10 pounds of high explosive and capable of reaching targets up to 3 miles away. The Navy was testing this system as an anti-kamikaze weapon for landing ships, but Flucky convinced them to mount one on Barb's forward deck, making her the United States Navy's only rocket-launching submarine. Barb departed midway on June 8th, loaded with 72 rockets and orders to wreak havoc along the Japanese coast, reaching the waters north of Hokkaido by June 20th. 2 days later, at 0230 on June 22nd, Flucky surfaced 3 miles off the town of Sherry, a community of 20,000 with a factory district producing military supplies. The submarine turned broadside to the shore, and Flucky gave the order. 12 rockets ripple-fired in just 5 seconds, screaming through the darkness before slamming into Sherry's industrial center and igniting fires across the waterfront. Barb submerged and vanished before the Japanese could mount a response. The first time in history a submarine had launched rockets against a shore target. Over the following 3 weeks, Barb fired 60 more rockets at factory towns dotting the Hokkaido and Kaputo coasts: Shikuka, Kashiho, Shitori. Japan's largest paper mill was destroyed, a leather tanning factory that manufactured pilot uniforms went up in flames, and small shipyards were reduced to wreckage. Flucky also employed Barb's 4-inch deck gun to shell military installations, with the submarine operating with complete impunity. By mid-July, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were actively hunting for her, but Flucky maintained constant movement, continuing to strike and keeping the enemy perpetually off balance. Then, on July 19th, while patrolling off southern Kaputo, Flucky noticed something through the periscope, a railroad running within 400 yards of the coastline, with trains moving north and south throughout, day and night, locomotives hauling freight cars filled with troops and military cargo. These trains represented a vital supply line feeding Japanese forces preparing to resist an American invasion. Flucky observed the trains for 3 days, counting schedules and studying the terrain. The beach appeared accessible, the tracks were vulnerable, and an idea began forming in his mind. The problem was clear enough. Barb could surface and shell the railroad with her deck gun, but that would only damage the tracks, which the Japanese would repair within hours. What Flucky wanted was to destroy a moving train for maximum damage, maximum disruption, and maximum psychological impact. But submarines didn't carry weapons designed for land targets. Torpedoes were useless for this purpose. The rockets lacked the precision needed for a moving target, and the deck gun couldn't track a train through coastal terrain. Flucky needed a different solution, something the Japanese wouldn't anticipate, something no submarine had ever attempted before. If you want to discover how Flucky solved this seemingly impossible problem, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to Flucky. On the evening of July 22nd, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders and Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield sat in Barb's cramped forward torpedo room, wrestling with a problem. Flucky had tasked them with devising a method to blow up a train without risking the shore party during the explosion. Hatfield studied the 55-pound scuttling charge, a device designed to destroy Barb if the crew had to abandon her to prevent capture. And an idea struck him. He recalled a childhood trick, placing walnuts on railroad tracks so passing trains would crack them open with their weight. What if they could rig the scuttling charge using the same principle, a micro switch buried beneath the rails with the locomotive's weight closing the circuit, causing the train to destroy itself? Flucky examined the device Hatfield and Saunders had constructed, a simple pressure switch salvaged from submarine components, 3 dry cell batteries wired in series, and the 55-pound scuttling charge packed with enough explosive to vaporize a locomotive. The entire assembly fit inside an empty pickle jar for waterproofing. When a train's weight depressed the rails even a quarter inch, the micro switch would complete the electrical circuit, with detonation occurring directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. Hatfield estimated the explosion would destroy at least the first 3 cars and derail everything behind them. The engineering was sound, but the mission itself presented enormous risks. Barb would need to surface within 1,000 yards of the Japanese coastline, while a shore party paddled inflatable rafts to the beach, crossed 400 yards of enemy territory, planted the explosive, and returned before dawn. If Japanese patrols discovered them, the men would be trapped on hostile soil with no support and no escape route available. If the submarine was spotted while surfaced in shallow water, she couldn't dive quickly enough to evade attack. Flucky calculated they would have roughly 90 minutes from the moment the rafts launched until Barb had to submerge. Every man aboard Barb volunteered for the mission. All 80 sailors raised their hands when Flucky asked for volunteers. The commander established strict criteria. First, unmarried men only, as he refused to create widows. Second, physical fitness and swimming ability, since the men would be paddling through surf and might need to swim if the rafts capsized. Third, preferably former Boy Scouts, as Flucky had been a scout himself, and believed their training in navigation and emergency procedures would prove invaluable if the party got separated or lost. Fourth, a mix of skills. He needed an electrician to wire the device, strong men to dig, and experienced sailors who could handle the rafts in darkness. Flucky selected 8 men. Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders would lead the shore party at 26 years old, having served aboard Barb since her commissioning in 1942 through every single war patrol in both Atlantic and Pacific. Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield would handle the explosive device, bringing his pre-war railroad experience and understanding of track construction. Signalman 2nd Class Francis Sever, Ship's Cook 1st Class Lawrence Newland, Torpedoman's Mate 3rd Class Edward Klingelsmith, Motor Machinist's Mate 2nd Class James Richard, Motor Machinist's Mate 1st Class John Markison, and Lieutenant William Walker would serve as the officer in charge. The crew began preparations in earnest. Barb's engineers cut steel plates from the engine room lower flats, then bent and welded them into improvised picks and shovels for digging. The shore party would need to bury the explosive in batteries at least 6 inches beneath the railroad ties to ensure the micro-switch functioned properly. The men packed survival gear in case they had to flee toward Soviet territory on the northern half of Sakhalin Island, 130 miles through mountain ranges. They also packed raw steaks, as intelligence reports indicated Japanese patrols used guard dogs along the coastal railroad, and the steaks might buy them precious seconds if they encountered animals. Weather became the critical factor. Flucky needed cloud cover to hide the 3/4 moon, as clear skies would illuminate the submarine and the rafts, making them visible to Japanese sentries. For 4 days, Barb patrolled off Kaputo while the crew watched the sky. Clear, then clear again. Flucky grew increasingly frustrated, as only 5 days remained in their patrol schedule before Barb would need to return to Midway. The window was closing fast. On the afternoon of July 22nd, cirrus clouds appeared on the horizon, and by evening, white stratus clouds were capping the mountain peaks along the Kaputo coast. Cloud cover was building from the west, and Flucky made his decision. They would execute the mission that night. Final preparations accelerated. The shore party checked their equipment, waterproof flashlights, pistols, the pickle jar containing batteries and explosives, digging tools, and Mae West life vests in case they had to swim. The 2 rubber rafts were readied on deck. At 2300 hours on July 22nd, Barb began her approach to the Kaputo coastline, with Flucky keeping the submarine on the surface while running slowly on electric motors to reduce noise. The sky cooperated. Cloud cover obscured the moon, and darkness blanketed the water. Through the periscope, Flucky could see the railroad running parallel to the shoreline, with no lights visible on the beach and no signs of patrol activity. The conditions were as favorable as they would ever be. Barb crept to within 950 yards of the shore, with the depth gauge showing only 36 feet of water. If Japanese patrol boats appeared, the submarine would have perhaps 90 seconds to crash dive, and even then, she might hit bottom before fully submerging. Flucky was betting everything on surprise and darkness. The 8 men assembled on deck wearing dark clothing as Saunders checked his watch. Midnight was approaching. Flucky gave the order, and the rafts went over the side. The rafts hit the water at 0:05 on July 23rd. Saunders and Walker took the lead raft with Hatfield and Sever, while the second raft carried Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, and Markison. The men pushed off from Barb's hull and began paddling toward the invisible shoreline with no lights and no sound except the dip of paddles and the whisper of water against rubber. The cloud cover held, and darkness remained absolute. Behind them, USS Barb sat low in the water, a darker shadow against the black ocean. 25 minutes to reach the beach. The men paddled steadily, maintaining formation. The surf was light, with no breakers to contend with, and the rafts grounded on sand at 0:30. All 8 men dragged the boats above the high tide line and secured them behind rocks and driftwood. Newland and Richard stayed with the rafts as guards, their job being to ensure the escape route remained open and to signal Barb if Japanese patrols approached. The other 6 men moved inland, becoming the first American combat troops to set foot on one of Japan's 4 main home islands. Kaputo was part of the Japanese prefecture system, administered from Tokyo, populated by Japanese civilians and defended by Japanese military forces. Every step they took was on enemy sovereign territory, and getting caught meant execution. The Geneva Convention didn't protect saboteurs operating behind enemy lines in civilian clothes. The terrain proved rougher than expected, with high grass concealing uneven ground. Sever nearly twisted his ankle in a depression hidden by vegetation, so they moved slowly, testing each step before committing their weight. 50 yards inland, they encountered a drainage ditch 3 feet deep with water at the bottom. The men lowered themselves into the ditch, crossed the muddy bottom, and climbed the opposite bank with their clothing now wet and heavy. 100 yards from the beach, they reached a packed earth road with vehicle tracks visible in the dirt. The road ran parallel to the railroad, connecting coastal villages. Saunders signaled a halt, and the men crouched in the grass beside the road and listened. No engine sounds, no voices, no movement. They crossed quickly, one at a time, then continued toward the railroad embankment, which was visible as a dark ridge against the slightly lighter sky. At 1:50, they reached the base of the railroad embankment. Walker and Saunders climbed to the tracks and examined the area. The rails ran north-south on a raised bed of gravel and crushed rock with wooden ties spaced evenly beneath the steel rails. The position offered good visibility in both directions. Too good, in fact, as any patrol coming along the tracks would leave the shore party completely exposed. They needed to work fast, but before they could begin digging, Sever grabbed Saunders' arm and pointed north. A faint vibration in the rails, then a distant sound. A train was coming. The men dropped flat in the grass beside the embankment as Hatfield pulled the pickle jar containing the explosive device tight against his chest. The vibration grew stronger, and the sound became a rhythmic chugging, a locomotive pulling freight cars through the darkness. The train appeared from the north at approximately 0155 with no headlight, operating under complete blackout conditions. The locomotive passed within 15 feet of where the Americans lay hidden, steam hissing and wheels clacking over rail joints. The men could feel the ground shaking as freight cars followed. 1, 2, 5, 10. The shore party counted silently. 15 freight cars. Then the train was passed, continuing south toward Kashiho, with the sound fading into the distance. Saunders waited 2 full minutes after the train disappeared before giving the signal to move. The men climbed onto the embankment and took positions. Klingelsmith, Sever, and Walker spread out as sentries. Klingelsmith moved north along the tracks 50 yards. Sever went south the same distance, and Walker positioned himself where he could see both directions and watch the road they had crossed. That left Saunders, Hatfield, and Markison to dig and plant the device. Hatfield selected the location, a straight section of track, where an approaching train would be traveling at maximum speed with no curves to slow it down and no grade to reduce momentum. The rails here ran level across flat ground for at least half a mile in both directions. Perfect. Hatfield knelt between the rails and examined the ties, knowing he needed to bury the explosive directly beneath the rail where the locomotive's weight would depress it enough to trigger the microswitch. Saunders and Markison began digging with the improvised tools. The gravel came away easily at first, but 6 inches down they hit compacted earth mixed with larger rocks, making the digging harder and slower. The steel shovel scraped against stones, with each sound seeming impossibly loud in the darkness. Hatfield kept checking his watch. They had been on shore for 30 minutes, and Flucky would wait 90 minutes maximum before Barb had to dive. The clock was running. At 02:15, Sever whistled softly from his position south along the tracks. Another train was coming. The shore party dropped flat again, with this train approaching from the south and moving north, the opposite direction from the first one. Hatfield lay beside the partially excavated hole, still clutching the pickle jar, while the digging tools were scattered across the gravel between the rails. If the locomotive's headlight was on, the engineer would see everything and the mission would be compromised, with Japanese troops flooding the area within minutes. But like the first train, this one ran in complete darkness with no headlight. The blackout protocols the Japanese were enforcing along the coastal railroad were actually protecting the American saboteurs. The locomotive thundered past at 02:17, another freight train with 14 cars this time. Hatfield counted them as they clattered overhead, and the shore party remained motionless until the sound faded completely to the north. 2 trains in 22 minutes. The railroad was more active at night than Flucky's observations had suggested. Saunders motioned the men back to work, knowing they had less than an hour before Barb would need to submerge. Markison attacked the hole with renewed urgency as the shovel bit into the compacted earth and rocks scraped free. Saunders used the pick to break up the harder sections, and within 15 minutes they had excavated a space roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep, directly beneath the western rail, large enough to accommodate the scuttling charge, the batteries, and the micro-switch assembly. Hatfield removed the components from the pickle jar. The 55-pound scuttling charge was a cylindrical metal canister packed with high explosive, enough power to blow a 3-foot hole in a submarine's pressure hull, and against a locomotive traveling at 40 miles per hour, the effect would be catastrophic. Hatfield positioned the charge at the bottom of the hole and packed dirt around it to hold it steady, then carefully placed the 3 dry cell batteries beside the charge and began wiring the circuit. The micro switch was the critical component. Hatfield had designed it to close when the rail above it depressed under the locomotive's weight. Japanese locomotives typically weighed between 60 and 80 tons, and that weight distributed across the wheels would push the rail downward approximately 1/4 to 1/2 inch. The micro switch needed to be positioned precisely. Too deep, and the rail wouldn't depress enough to trigger it. Too shallow, and vibrations from normal track expansion might cause a premature detonation. Hatfield worked by touch more than sight, with his waterproof flashlight providing minimal illumination directed downward into the hole to prevent the beam from being visible at a distance. He connected the positive terminal from the batteries to one side of the microswitch, with the negative terminal running to the scuttling charge detonator. The final connection from the detonator back to the microswitch would complete the circuit, but Hatfield left that wire disconnected. He would make the final connection last, just before they departed. Until then, the device was safe. At 02:35, Hatfield had the wiring completed except for the final connection. He looked at Saunders and nodded. Saunders signaled Walker, and the sentries began pulling back to the worksite. Klingelsmith returned from the north, Sever from the south, and Walker came up from his observation position near the road. The 6 men gathered at the tracks as Hatfield made the final connection. The circuit was now live, with any significant downward pressure on the rail above the microswitch triggering the explosion. He covered the device carefully with dirt and gravel, smoothing it to match the surrounding ballast. No visible disturbance. A track inspector walking this section in daylight might notice the slightly disturbed gravel, but a locomotive engineer traveling at speed in darkness would see nothing unusual. The shore party moved off the railroad embankment and began working their way back toward the beach, using the same route in reverse, across the road, through the drainage ditch, through the high grass. They moved faster now, as the mission was complete and the explosive was armed. Every minute they remained on Japanese soil increased the risk of discovery. At 02:45, they reached the beach where Newland and Richard were waiting with the rafts. All 8 men dragged the rafts to the waterline and climbed aboard. Saunders checked the luminous dial on his watch. They had been ashore for exactly 1 hour and 40 minutes, and Barb would be preparing to dive. The rafts pushed off from the beach, and the men began paddling toward the position where the submarine waited. The distance back to Barb was 950 yards, and in calm water, with experienced paddlers, that meant roughly 15 minutes. They were halfway to the submarine when Flucky's voice cut through the darkness, shouting through a megaphone from Barb's conning tower and telling them to paddle faster. Another train was coming down the tracks. The men in the rafts could hear it now, the distant sound of a locomotive building speed. Flucky had spotted the train through Barb's periscope while tracking the shore party's return. The headlight was off, but the locomotive's exhaust plume was visible against the mountain silhouette. The train was approaching from the north, heading directly toward the section of track where Hatfield had buried the explosive device. And the timing was going to be catastrophically close. Saunders and his men drove their paddles into the water with desperate rhythm. The rafts were still 400 yards from Barb, and the submarine sat impossibly low in the water with her hull barely visible even at close range. Flucky had moved her to within 600 yards of the shore, decreasing the distance the rafts needed to travel, but putting Barb in water so shallow she would scrape bottom if she attempted a crash dive. Every man aboard the submarine who wasn't essential to operations was on deck watching the shore and the approaching train. The rafts closed the distance, 300 yards, 200. The sound of the train grew louder, and through the darkness, the men paddling could now see the locomotive's silhouette. It was traveling fast, probably 40 or 45 miles per hour, with the engineer making up time and pushing hard through the coastal section where the tracks ran straight and level. The locomotive was perhaps a mile north of the buried explosive, maybe 90 seconds away. Flucky had a decision to make. If he waited for the rafts to reach Barb before diving, the submarine might be caught on the surface when Japanese response forces arrived after the explosion. Coastal artillery could open fire and patrol boats could converge on their position. But if he submerged now, the 8 men in the rafts would be stranded on the surface with no way to escape. Flucky made his choice. He ordered Barb to turn and prepare for emergency dive, but he would wait. The shore party had earned that much. The rafts reached Barb at 0246, with the men scrambling up the submarine's hull and through the deck hatches. Saunders was the last man off the rafts. The rubber boats were cut loose and abandoned to drift and eventually sink. No time to retrieve them. Flucky ordered the deck crew below and sealed the hatches. Barb's diesel engines rumbled to life as the submarine began turning away from shore, accelerating toward deeper water. At 0247 on July 23, 1945, the northbound train reached the section of track where the micro-switch waited. The locomotive's lead wheels passed over the device, 68 tons of steel and steam pressing down on the rails. The western rail depressed, the micro-switch closed, the electrical circuit completed, and 55 pounds of high explosive detonated directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. The explosion was visible from Barb, even though the submarine was now 700 yards offshore and accelerating. A massive fireball erupted along the railroad embankment as the locomotive's boiler ruptured instantly, adding superheated steam to the explosion. Metal fragments shot upward in a fountain of burning debris, with pieces of the engine flying 200 feet into the air and tumbling end over end before crashing back to Earth. The locomotive itself disintegrated. The boiler split into 3 sections. The drive wheels separated from the chassis, and the smokestack and cab section were hurled forward, cartwheeling down the embankment toward the beach. The freight cars following the locomotive had no time to brake. The first car slammed into the wreckage at full speed, and accordioned, the second car climbed up and over the first with its wooden frame splintering, and the third car jackknifed sideways and rolled off the embankment. Cars 4 through 16 piled into the growing mass of twisted metal and shattered wood. The sound reached Barb as rolling thunder that echoed off the coastal mountains. Fires ignited across the wreckage, and ammunition in several cars began cooking off, adding secondary explosions to the chaos. Flucky ordered all non-essential personnel topside to witness what they had accomplished, and dozens of submariners crowded onto Barb's deck and conning tower to watch the fires burning along the Kaputo coastline. Japanese propaganda would later claim the train was carrying civilian passengers, but American intelligence indicated otherwise. Trains running at night on coastal military railroads were transporting troops and war material. The men aboard that train were soldiers headed south to reinforce defensive positions against the expected American invasion. Barb continued accelerating toward deeper water, and within 10 minutes, the submarine would be in water deep enough to dive safely. Flucky allowed himself a moment to consider what his crew had just achieved. They had destroyed a Japanese military train using a submarine, the first and only time in naval history. Such an operation had been executed successfully. But more importantly, they had conducted the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home island soil during the entire Pacific War. The celebration was premature, however. Japanese searchlights were sweeping the water from coastal positions, looking for the submarine that had just declared war on their railroad. The searchlights originated from at least 3 different coastal positions, Japanese military installations responding to the explosion. The beams swept across the water in coordinated patterns, searching for the submarine they knew must be responsible. Barb was still on the surface, running at maximum speed toward deeper water. Her dark gray paint helped her blend into the black ocean. But if one of those searchlight beams caught her, coastal artillery would open fire within seconds. Flucky ordered a course change, angling northeast away from the search pattern. Barb's diesel engines were running at 150% overload, the same emergency power setting Flucky had used during the escape from Namquan Harbor. The submarine was making 23 knots on the surface, leaving a phosphorescent wake that would be visible if the searchlights got close enough. The depth gauge showed 48 feet, still too shallow for a safe dive, but better than the 36 feet they had been operating in near shore. At 0200, Barb crossed into water 60 feet deep, and Flucky gave the order to dive. The submarine's bow tilted downward as ballast tanks flooded. The deck crew had already secured all topside equipment, and within 90 seconds, Barb was completely submerged and leveling off at periscope depth. The searchlights continued sweeping the surface above them, but the submarine was invisible now. Flucky maintained slow speed on electric motors to minimize noise signature, knowing Japanese patrol boats would be launching soon if they hadn't already. The submarine stayed submerged for 6 hours, moving slowly away from Kaputo, while Japanese forces searched the coastal waters. At 0800 on July 23rd, Flucky risked raising the periscope. No patrol boats visible. The searchlights had been extinguished with dawn, and smoke still rose from the railroad embankment where the train had exploded. Barb surfaced in deeper water and resumed patrol, but the mission wasn't complete. Flucky had 4 days remaining before Barb needed to return to Midway, and he intended to use every hour. Over the next 72 hours, Barb continued attacking Japanese coastal targets. On July 24th, the submarine surfaced off Shari and used her 4-inch deck gun to shell a military radio station, with direct hits destroying the antenna array and setting the building on fire. On July 25th, Barb attacked a small shipyard at Shiratori, destroying 2 wooden coastal freighters under construction. On July 26th, the submarine fired her final 12 rockets at a military garrison on Kunashiri Island, then withdrew toward open ocean. Japanese aircraft had been searching for Barb throughout the final patrol days, with reconnaissance planes crisscrossing the Sea of Okhotsk, trying to locate the submarine that was terrorizing their coastal infrastructure. Flucky evaded them through constant movement and by diving whenever aircraft were spotted. On July 27th, Barb set course for Midway Island. The 12th and final war patrol was complete. USS Barb arrived at Midway on August 2nd, 1945. The crew assembled on deck in dress uniforms, holding the submarine's battle flag, a flag unlike any other in the United States Navy. 17 patches representing ships sunk, symbols for the Presidential Unit Citation and Navy Unit Commendation, rocket and gun symbols denoting shore bombardments, 6 Navy Crosses earned by crew members, 23 Silver Stars, 23 Bronze Stars, and a Medal of Honor ribbon at the top representing Flucky's award from the previous patrol. And at the bottom center of the flag, a new symbol, a Japanese locomotive. The only submarine in history to sink a train now displayed that achievement on her battle colors. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself came to Midway to greet Barb's crew, and the flag was photographed for naval archives. 8 men posed with the flag, the same 8 who had gone ashore on Kaputo and planted the explosive that destroyed the train. Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Markison, and Walker. They looked like ordinary sailors, young men who might have been working in factories or on farms, if not for the war. But they had accomplished something no military force had managed during the entire Pacific conflict. They had conducted offensive ground operations on Japanese home island territory. The train explosion became legendary within the submarine service. Other boats had attacked shore targets with deck guns, and some had launched rockets like Barb, but no other submarine had put men on enemy soil to destroy a target and extracted them successfully. The mission represented a new capability. Submarines weren't just commerce raiders or torpedo platforms. They could project power ashore through sabotage and special operations. Flucky received his 4th Navy Cross for Barb's 12th patrol, with the citation specifically mentioning the train attack and the rocket bombardments. Combined with his Medal of Honor and 3 previous Navy Crosses, Flucky became one of the most decorated submarine commanders in American naval history. But when reporters asked him about his achievements, he consistently deflected credit to his crew. 6 days after Barb reached Midway, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 9 days later, Japan surrendered, and the war ended before USS Barb could conduct another patrol. Japan's surrender on August 15th meant the submarine's combat career was over. After 12 war patrols spanning 3 years, 5 in the Atlantic Theater during the early war years, and 7 in the Pacific, where Barb had compiled one of the most devastating records of any submarine in the American fleet. The official tally credited her with sinking 17 enemy vessels, totaling 96,628 tons. But those numbers didn't capture the full scope of what Barb had accomplished. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee reviewed Flucky's claims after the war and confirmed the destruction of the escort carrier Unyo on September 17, 1944. 22,500 tons. The carrier had been transporting aircraft and pilots from Japan to the Philippines when Barb's torpedoes found her in the South China Sea, and the ship sank in 40 minutes, taking most of her crew and cargo to the bottom. Barb had also destroyed numerous smaller warships, frigates, patrol craft, and coastal defense vessels. The attacks on merchant shipping had strangled supply lines feeding Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. But the train remained Barb's most famous kill, and naval historians would spend decades analyzing the mission, the planning, the execution, and the risks involved. What made the operation remarkable wasn't just its audacity. It was the proof of concept. Submarines could conduct operations far beyond traditional anti-shipping warfare. They could launch missiles, bombard shore installations, insert sabotage teams onto hostile territory, and extract them successfully. The mission on Kaputo demonstrated capabilities that would define submarine warfare for the next 70 years. Flucky's innovation with the rocket launcher proved particularly prescient. In 1945, submarines launching rockets at shore targets seemed like a desperate improvisation born from lack of merchant shipping to attack. But within a decade, submarines armed with guided missiles became the most powerful weapons platforms in naval arsenals. The Regulus cruise missile program, Polaris ballistic missiles, Trident, Ohio-class submarines carrying enough nuclear firepower to destroy entire nations. All of them traced their conceptual lineage back to Flucky, bolting a Mark 51 rocket launcher onto Barb's deck and proving the concept worked. USS Barb herself had a less glorious post-war fate. The submarine was decommissioned in May 1947 and placed in reserve, then recommissioned in 1951 for training duties before being decommissioned again in February 1954. That same year, she underwent Guppy conversion, a modernization program that gave World War II submarines improved underwater performance. In December 1954, Barb was loaned to the Italian Navy under the Mutual Defense Assistance Act, with the Italians renaming her Enrico Tazzoli, after an Italian submarine commander from World War I. The submarine served in the Italian Navy for 18 years, but by 1972 she was obsolete, worn out, and no longer economically viable to maintain. The Italian government sold Enrico Tazzoli for scrap metal at a final price of approximately $100,000, roughly the cost of a modest house. When Flucky learned what had happened, he reportedly said that if the crew had known, they would have pooled their money to buy Barb and bring her back to the United States as a museum ship. But by the time anyone realized, the submarine was already being cut apart in an Italian scrapyard. Only Barb's battle flag survived. The Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, acquired it for their collection, and visitors can see it today displayed behind glass. The 17 ship symbols, the train at the bottom, the Medal of Honor ribbon at the top. The flag tells the story more eloquently than any historical account. Eugene Flucky remained in the Navy after the war, serving as an aide to Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, then to Admiral Chester Nimitz. In 1960, President Eisenhower approved his promotion to Rear Admiral. Flucky commanded Amphibious Group 4, served as President of the Naval Board of Inspection and Survey, commanded the entire Pacific Submarine Force from 1964 to 1966, and finished his career as Director of Naval Intelligence. He retired in 1972 after 37 years of service. Retirement didn't mean inactivity, however. Flucky and his wife Marjorie moved to Portugal and opened an orphanage in 1974, running it for 8 years and providing homes for children who had lost families. Marjorie died in 1979, and Flucky remarried in 1980, continuing the orphanage work until it closed in 1982. In 1992, he published Thunder Below, his memoir of commanding USS Barb, and the book became required reading at the Naval Academy. Flucky died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 93, and was buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis. But there was one statistic Flucky valued more than all the tonnage sunk, all the medals earned, and all the recognition received: zero. 0 Purple Hearts awarded to anyone who served under his command during 5 war patrols. 0 casualties. That statistic defined Eugene Flucky's command philosophy more than any tactical innovation or daring raid. He took calculated risks, but never reckless ones. He pushed his crew to the absolute limits of submarine capability, but never beyond the point where training and skill could compensate for danger. 5 war patrols, hundreds of depth charge attacks, thousands of miles through minefields and shallow water, countless hours surfaced in enemy-controlled seas, and every single man who served under Flucky came home alive. The crew members of USS Barb went on to live ordinary post-war lives. Saunders returned to civilian work, Hatfield went back to the railroad industry, and the others married, raised families, and worked regular jobs. They rarely spoke about what they had done on Kaputo, as the mission remained classified for years. Even after declassification, the men didn't seek publicity. They had been doing their jobs, following orders, and trying to end the war and get home. The fact that their job involved paddling ashore on enemy territory to blow up a train was simply what the situation required, but history remembers what they accomplished. The 8 men who went ashore that night in July 1945 conducted the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home islands during the entire Pacific War. No Marines landed on Honshu, no Army troops fought on Hokkaido, and no paratroopers dropped on Kyushu. The only American combatants to engage enemy forces on Japanese sovereign home island territory were 8 submariners from USS Barb, armed with shovels, a pickle jar full of batteries, and 55 pounds of high explosive. The mission's impact extended beyond the immediate destruction. The train explosion forced Japanese military planners to divert resources to coastal railroad defense. Guards were increased, patrols were expanded, and engineering units were assigned to inspect tracks daily. Those resources came from somewhere else. Troops who might have reinforced defensive positions and equipment that might have been used against American invasion forces. The psychological effect was equally significant. If American submarines could strike inland targets with impunity, nowhere was safe. The rocket attacks Flucky pioneered had similar effects. Coastal factories and military installations were no longer protected by distance from the ocean, as a submarine could surface 3 miles offshore and destroy targets that previously required air raids. The 72 rockets Barb fired during her 12th patrol demonstrated a capability that would revolutionize naval warfare within a generation. The numbers tell part of the story. 17 ships sunk, 96,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, 4 Navy crosses and a Medal of Honor for the commander, 8 battle stars for the submarine. The first rocket attack from a submarine, and the first and only submarine to sink a train. But the most important number was 0. 0 casualties among the crew during 5 combat patrols. Flucky brought every man home, and that was his greatest achievement, not the tonnage, not the medals, not the tactical innovations that changed submarine warfare forever. He brought his men home alive. USS Barb's battle flag hangs in a museum in Connecticut, with the locomotive symbol at the bottom still drawing questions from visitors who don't know the story. When they learn what happened on July 23, 1945, they understand. They understand that submarine warfare wasn't just about torpedoes and periscopes. It was about innovation, adaptation, courage, and commanders who valued their crews' lives above personal glory. Eugene Flucky, Paul Saunders, Billy Hatfield, and the 72 other men who served aboard USS Barb during those 5 patrols proved what submarines could accomplish when led by brilliant commanders and crewed by sailors willing to paddle ashore on enemy territory with explosives and shovels. They sank ships, fired the first submarine-launched missiles, destroyed coastal targets, and they blew up a train, the only submarine in history that can make that claim. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about submariners who changed naval warfare with rockets and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served, or just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Eugene Flucky and the crew of USS Barb don't disappear into silence.